Hey, this is the Ethics Experts. If it's your first time joining us, welcome. And if you are a returning subscriber, hey friend, hope you're having an amazing day. You see what happens when you subscribe to the Ethics Experts? You get a bonus greeting on every single episode. So hit that subscribe button as we join forces and change the world by making our workplaces better. I'm here with Scott Schools. He is the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer at Uber. Has a really interesting background in history, and super excited to get you on and pick your brain about everything ethics and compliance. How's it going, Scott?
It's going great. Thanks. Nice to be here. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, we had a little hiccup on the front end. Some of our tech wasn't working, and I was in a slight panic. So now the blood pressure's falling back down to normal, and now we can just have a little conversation here. So, Scott, you have a really cool background. You worked as assistant deputy AG for a while. Then you worked in private practice for a while, I think, and then now you've landed at Uber. So you have a lot of great experience that I think our listeners who are really, largely ethics and compliance and human resource folks who are trying to make their workplaces better. You got a lot of cool perspectives to share. So why don't we start with this question, which I love. How did you, I love this. Everybody has such like a whining story on how they got into ethics and compliance. How did you go from being a young kid playing outside, you know what I'm saying, playing baseball probably, into now, running ethics and compliance for one of the most, popular companies in the world?
Yeah, I would probably say the answer to that question is like a lot of people, largely accidental and some of it dumb luck. I think I started my career as a lawyer, as a prosecutor, and did that for a while and loved it. Stayed mostly with the Department of Justice for the early part of my career. Left in 2013, went into private practice for a while. In 2016, got asked to come back to the Department of Justice to work in a role there with the Deputy Attorney General office. Deputy Attorney General is essentially an ethics advisor for the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General in a career position in an otherwise political office. So it was a role that had been held by a longtime department employee who had been there over 50 years, a dear friend of mine, but he passed away and I went to fill that role. I was there a couple of years and got a phone call out of the blue from a friend of mine who said that Tony West, who is our chief legal officer, was looking for a chief compliance officer at Uber, and did I have any interest? So totally out of the blue, not something I had even thought about, to be honest. And it was one of those opportunities that I thought, I'm happy where I am, but then I think because of the sort of opportunity to round out a career that was in government and private practice, but never in business, and then to have a chance to do that at a company like Uber that was iconic and I think super interesting and growing fast and had a lot of really interesting background, just ended up being an opportunity I felt like I couldn't say no to, and I've been here about 4.5 years.
So when you came back to the DOJ in that it was, what did you call it? Ethics advisor?
Yep.
Yeah. And so, I mean, that sounds like a pretty cool role that I'd love to hear some more about. But I mean, it sounds like, given the way you just characterized that you kind of probably saw yourself to be, being there for a bit.
Absolutely. When I took that job, I probably envisioned that I would retire from that job.
Okay.
So I really had no notion that I would leave it. And it was a fascinating job. It's one of those roles where you get to engage on topics at the Department of Justice that are some of the most important and difficult and hairy problems that the Department of Justice face. It was fascinating, hard, and stressful, but I really enjoyed it and I love the department. But ultimately, just decided that this was an opportunity I couldn't pass up.
So what was it, aside from it being an iconic brand, that caused you to jump ship from a really cool, interesting, phenomenal position at sort of this, apex type like regulatory body that so many ethics and compliance folks have to, understand and work for, so to speak? What were those things that made it exciting enough, or potentially exciting enough for you to, make that leap?
Yeah, well, Uber was at an interesting place in its culture. Dara Khosrowshahi was the fairly new CEO. He had started probably about 6-7 months prior to me getting that first call. There had been Travis Kalanick had been the prior CEO, and he had left. I had talked to Tony West, who was our chief legal officer at the time and still is, and he told me that Uber was on sort of a culture journey where they were trying to address some issues that the company had and was they were moving together. The leadership team was moving the company in a different direction, and that I could be a big part of that. And it just seemed like a really, really cool challenge, and one that I would both learn from and have impact in, and it would be a great opportunity. And it's been a blast.
It seems like I don't know. I'm kind of new to this whole thing. I haven't been in this industry since the 90s when it seemed to have like really kind of kicked off. It seems like we're talking about culture more and more these days. It seems like more and more light bulbs are turning on within organizations for the transformative effect that culture can play on, the overall integrity of the organization and then the positive externalities that come from that. So obviously you got that, get that, and have probably got that for a while. But when you came into this company that, as you said, had some challenges. I mean, it's a massive company. You have a very interesting, footprint, and your business model is very interesting. I'm sure you knew that like turning that sort of cultural ship was going to be difficult, but like what was surprising along the way? Like what seemed to be harder than you thought? What seemed to be easier than you thought in terms of driving like true, authentic cultural change in this kind of a company?
Yeah, great question. I think the biggest challenge is scale. Uber at that point was operating already all across the globe. The company had been built sort of very locally. So even though it's a global company, the business in, for example, in Seattle would have been built by a very localized team. So very kind of widespread organization, and the challenge of changing a culture in an organization like that's not very kind of centralized is, I think, even harder. And so as over time, the company's become probably more centralized. So getting messages out and a consistent leadership message has become easier. And I think we've done a really good job of that. But I think at the time, the geographic spread and the sort of the footprint of the company, which had grown up very locally and with various local operating models and cultures, et cetera, made it a bigger challenge.
Uber is one of those, I don't know, not the first, but definitely like a super famous unicorn. And I think what a lot of people don't recognize is that there's, something that came as like a fast growing startup many times, can get very big and still have that kind of startup feel, that kind of figure it out, get it done type of mentality. And hey, we're going to kind of, not every company that is as big as GE is a GE. GE is like, to me, the picture of like super dialed in, processes everywhere, very consistent, and so forth. Were you surprised by anything like this at this company, and what opportunities did that sort of present for you in terms of, creating those points of leverage from messaging or like cultural change or something like that?
I think the best part of the opportunity in some ways in terms of the challenge we faced on the compliance and ethics side was that our leadership was committed to change. And so because we had a very solid message at the top in terms of what was being expected, Dara had come in and created new company values that included do the right thing, period, as one of the values. He'd been out in the public talking about that, discussing the change that the company was going to try to undergo. So I think it provided a platform where you have the ability to talk to folks about culture change in the language of the CEO, who had already talked to the company about culture change. And I think it enabled the team and the whole organization to move in a direction more quickly because the tone from the top was so consistent.
Yeah, that's it's so critical. And, there's almost sort of three flavors of it. Of course, it's like a full sort of spectrum, but, sort of silence, kind of ambivalence, or like that full endorsement, which is what you're talking about. I would imagine that last one I mentioned is probably like exponentially different to exist in than that sort of middle ground ambivalence. We had a talk the other day, a webinar with J.S. Nelson, who wrote this cool book, Business Ethics, Everything You Need to Know. She's a Harvard law professor. And there were so many people in our chat of, ethics and compliance officers and mid-sized companies that, you could just tell by the nature of their questions that like they didn't have they didn't have that kind of like CEO endorsement. And many times folks are trying to like make ends meet, and they know what the right thing to do is. They know, man, we really have to push these values forward, but sometimes it's like that lone voice crying out in the wilderness that no one's listening to. Yeah, it's just I mean, what would you tell somebody in that kind of a position? Is it, hey, do what you can from a grassroots standpoint, or like guerrilla ethics? That's a book title, by the way, I just thought of, Guerrilla Ethics. Or would it be, hey, let's try to activate the CEO and sort of persuade them about the positive externalities that a more, authentically, honest, or a culture built on true integrity is going to provide to the things you care about, CEO, which are maybe the bottom line, or, more cash, or whatever. How would you kind of navigate that if you were in this type of position I'm talking about?
Yeah, I think it's very hard to build a culture from the bottom up. I think in a company, the reason the Department of Justice and others who are evaluating compliance programs in the context of something having gone wrong are going to look at the tone from the top at your company is because if the tone from the top is not consistent and is not consistent with the message that you as a compliance officer are trying to spread within your company, it's going to be super challenging. And I think from my perspective, when I was contemplating the Uber opportunity, I had an opportunity to meet with leadership and to sort of test drive whether their commitment to culture change was serious or not. And that was a big factor for me in deciding, is this a challenge I want to take on? Am I going to have top cover, or am I going to be a voice in the wilderness trying to change a culture that our leadership actually is quite comfortable with? And obviously I determined the former, so made the leap, but I think it's super hard to, especially if you don't even have like, I mean, you could have sort of your CEO and your very top leadership doesn't have the tone that you, or doesn't want to talk about culture, but you've got sort of second line leaders who are doing that. So you've got some top cover. I think you have a chance. But if folks were to tell me as a potential chief ethics and compliance officer, I want you to come in and change our culture, and we don't want any role in it, then I'm not sure there is a path to success in that environment.
Yeah, you're probably right. I mean, kids aren't going to raise themselves, right?
That's right.
You need to get that sort of oversight to get the reinforcement, and then assuming that it's authentic, there's going to be the budget that comes along with it, or the willingness to hop onto a town hall or give a message, to help reinforce those things. It's really nuts in a way. Like, to me, this whole culture thing is like so apparent. And it's apparent as like, in terms of like, that's the lever to pull. That is how you're going to actually make your workplace better. And if you're doing that, all those other things that the, Wall Street analysts care about, that the shareholders care about, are going to happen in a sustainable way. But I continue to be, surprised by the disparity across leadership, across companies in our economy that don't seem to that maybe pay it lip service. Like, it still seems like there's a sort of a minority of folks that are fully bought into this thing that you and I are talking about today. What do you think that is, and why do you think it's taking so long, and what do you think it's going to take to change it?
I think I'm not sure I have the perfect set of information to answer the question with full knowledge, but I'll give you my gut is that folks haven't yet connected the dots always between culture and financial success. And they companies that have succeeded with a bad culture may think they can continue to succeed with a bad culture. And why do I want to spend a bunch of money for a bunch of compliance people who can come in and not improve my bottom line? In fact, maybe impair my bottom line without any tangible benefit that I can, at the end of the year, show my shareholders. We hired 5 people to do compliance, and our net profits went up X amount. They're not connected in that way. It's not that direct. So I think that there's probably sometimes skepticism about whether or not the culture change will actually affect the bottom line or not. Whereas I think if you look at, I've seen plenty of surveys that will show world's most ethical companies that how they compare to companies that are not on that list, or that are not walking the walk on the culture and ethics side, just don't perform as well. I I kind of like to analogize it to sports teams, and especially college sports teams who change personnel entirely over 4 years, but their culture persists over decades. And the ones who have good cultures succeed, and the ones who don't have good cultures don't succeed. And you change the personnel over and over, but it's the same thing. And I think that it's a fairly close analogy to what happens at companies. The companies with good cultures are going to succeed over time. The companies with bad cultures may have short-term success or limited success, but it's not sustainable. I don't think for the long term.
That's such a great analogy. That college sports analogy is really phenomenal because it's true. It's like if this is the way that we do things, it doesn't matter sort of who's in the seats because they're going to continue to do those things that way. That sort of supersedes the person in the seat. And
Yep.
The ones that sort of are a little bit more, volatile in terms of like successful years and unsuccessful years, it's usually tied down to a certain coach or a certain, player that maybe is just so, phenomenal. They can just have that impact, but it can't, to your point, sustain forward. It's a really phenomenal analogy. So just so you know, if you ever hear me use that, there's an implied like citation to you because that was a good one. Okay.
No worries.
So you came from the DOJ, you went to private practice, you went back to the DOJ. How did your I want to kind of go back a little bit. How did your involvement in that organization or in that department change between those two stints there?
So when I was, excuse me, when I was there earlier, when I left in 2013, I was sort of in an understudy role to the guy whose job I actually ended up replacing when I went back in 16. So I had been a line prosecutor, a supervisor in U.S. Attorney's Office. I've been the U.S. Attorney in South Carolina and San Francisco. And then when I went back to Washington in 2008, I was really sort of in an understudy position for a guy named David Margolis, who became my mentor and was kind of known as the Yoda of the Department of Justice.
Yeah.
He'd been there 50 years. He's who everybody went to when they had something really sticky. I worked very closely with him in anticipation of replacing him at some point. After about 5 years of that, he didn't show any signs that he was going anywhere. I was feeling a little underutilized in a understudy role, and so I went into private practice for a while. And then he passed away in 2016, and that's when I went back to do that role. But at that point, I was sort of the point person for all of those hard issues that he had been handling, as opposed to being sort of his understudy.
So I think for a lot of people, the DOJ is this big sort of like monolithic, scary place. You lived on the inside in this, for lack of a better term, this, I don't know, Yoda training ground. I'm just kidding, but like. You were almost like a task force or something, right? It sounds like sticky issues were brought to your area. What were some of those things? What did that stuff look like, and how did that end up rooting down into ethics? Like, what did you learn along the way? What were some of those battles you fought or whatever that ended up equipping you to like really grow into who you are right now?
So I'm going to have to answer that question kind of generally because I can't talk too much about a lot of the specifics. Yeah. But generally, when difficult cases or difficult issues confronted the department, whether an attorney general needed to recuse him or herself from a particular matter, whether there were issues involved in a case about how we would resolve the case, whether there were financial conflicts that came up with senior officials of the department, whatever the issue was, they would refer to that role as the senior department career official. So the Attorney General's office and the Deputy Attorney General's office, the two top officials at Justice, are primarily staffed with political appointees. Mm-hmm. So at the leadership level, they wanted to have someone who's in a career position who can provide the institutional perspective when the department is making hard decisions about difficult cases.
Gotcha. So that gives, it's just by the nature of the position, it sort of insulates it from the political winds. It's not, up for reelection or whatever, or reappointment, whatever it might be. And you can maintain that sort of like that institutional continuity where we're building on the things that we've learned. We can remain consistent in how we handle, this case relative to the last case that was sort of similar to it, something like that.
That's exactly right. So I was fortunate enough to be there through two presidential transitions when there was a party change. So on January 19th, I would go to work with one group of people, and on January 21st, I would show up and it'd be a whole new group there.
What was that like?
It was it was fascinating, a little intimidating. I mean, I think
Yeah.
it was, you don't really know. You got a whole new set of colleagues, and they don't know you, and you don't know them so much. But one of the great things about working there at that level, especially, is, and in the department generally, the quality of talent is really extreme. Like we meet some people who just are super, super talented, and it's a real joy to work there. In part because of the level of talent with the colleagues who work there. It's always an impressive group of people.
Yeah, it's when you're surrounded by those kinds of people, it is, when you're on a team of, top performers, so to speak, in your field. I mean, there's so much growth. It's like hyper growth, right? You learn so many tricks and so many perspectives, and it's really I'm sure you look back on, so many lessons you learned from there that you're carrying forward, in your current position.
Right.
But let's go back even a little further. This is going to be a Quentin Tarantino style ethics episode. Talk to me when you're back in law school. Like, how did you get from law school into the DOJ? What was it about, becoming a prosecutor that was enticing to you, that attracted you? And how did that experience end up kind of pushing you toward this really cool role within the Department of Justice?
So, good question. I went to law school at the University of Texas, which is back then, and maybe still today, I don't know, but largely it kind of steers people into commercial tracks somehow, whether you're going to be a commercial litigator or do transactions or do oil and gas, et cetera. I wanted to be a litigator. I knew that much. So when I finished school, I went to clerk for a federal judge in South Carolina. I went back home, which is where I'm from. Spent 2 years clerking for that judge, and during that time was really the first time that I even understood that there was such a thing as an assistant U.S. attorney and what they did. But because I was in the courtroom with the judge, I saw them a lot. I knew that they were in court. I became knowledgeable about what they did, and I was sort of fascinated by that and by the fact that they were litigating in federal court, which is a great experience for litigator. Right. It's a great, it's the highest level of litigation, I think.
Yeah,
it's the big leagues. And so as I was concluding my 2-year clerkship, there was going to be a new U.S. attorney, and he had, by happenstance, happened to have a bunch of new positions that he was able to fill as a result of some budget increases. I got introduced to him by my judge and then hired by him at that point.
Oh, how cool.
And it really, I would say, like, that changed my life in the sense that it took me on a career path that I never really envisioned. But once I got on it, I loved it. I loved the white hat of the job. I loved being in court. I loved working with FBI agents and DEA agents to make cases. It was a lot of fun. And super interesting and challenging, and tried a lot of cases, and it was sort of exactly what I had hoped it would be. And then I think at some point, I had moved up into management within the U.S. Attorney's office in South Carolina. There was going to be a new U.S. attorney, and I had, in 2004, it was a long time ago, tried 2 capital cases. So I'd been in court that year for about 14 weeks total. Tried one case, it was 6 weeks, another that was 8 weeks. And just thought, I'm ready to go do something a little different. I reached out to a friend of mine who was in DC. She said, we need general counsel at the executive office for U.S. attorneys, which is the sort of the management component of the department that provides services out to the U.S. attorneys' offices throughout the field. The job wasn't really in my wheelhouse. It was like government ethics and employment law, which I had no real experience in. But otherwise, it was a good group of people, and I thought it would be interesting, and I'd get to engage a lot with sort of insiders at the department, and I went for it, and it turned out great. That's when I met David Margolis. We worked closely when I was in that role, and that led me to kind of do an interim stint as the U.S. attorney in San Francisco, and then to go back to Washington to work as David's understudy. So it was a sort of a totally unintentional trajectory, but one that got me to a good place.
I'm just always so fascinated by these kinds of stories, especially from someone like you that, you seem very, you seem like a gut-driven guy, but also very opportunistic. Like, you see something that opens up and you say, well, maybe I can do that. Or, like you talked about this, this employment law thing that you didn't really have a lot of experience in, but like you could kind of zoom out enough to see the bigger picture. And I've noticed, I've had a bunch of these kinds of episodes, and I have this kind of thing for litigators because I think they have a really interesting skill set, and they're able to kind of see the big picture, but also the details and make those connections. And then it seems like over time that becomes like a really strong muscle for them, and they can flex into both of those, and that works within a program or within an organization, and it also works. It seems to work. This is just like my, the mosaic that I'm like, looking at a little bit here. It also seems to work in their own career. Do you feel like I'm kind of close to that? Your ability to kind of zoom into the details, but also see the big picture enough to drive something forward and be opportunistic when you see kind of what levers might drive, the train forward faster.
Yeah, probably so. I think one of the things that happens as a litigator, because every case is different, you end up sort of pivoting from case to case
Right.
and learning a lot that you have to learn to handle a particular case or to go to trial. The facts are different. While you do sort of learn the techniques of trying cases and improve as you do more of those, the fact that you were good
Right.
in the last trial is not going to make you good in this one unless you work hard and you learn whatever you need to learn about that case. So I think you feel like you develop the capacity to learn things and to try new things and to understand things in a way that ultimately, as a trial lawyer, you're going to have to explain those things to a jury that doesn't know anything about what you're talking about. So I think it does sort of create the muscle to be able to learn new things and to understand them and then explain them to audiences or constituencies that you need to talk to.
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess I hadn't thought about it that way, but you get good at getting smart quick. You can get smart on something quickly, but then you do that enough times, you start to get kind of confident that like, well, I'm sure I'll be able to figure this out. And that in itself is like, that in itself is a muscle that, a lot of people in a lot of other different professions or different tracks don't get to develop for one reason or another,
I think that's right. And I mentioned that I'd gone to San Francisco to be the U.S. attorney for a year. Well, that was one of those opportunities that it came along very quickly.
Yeah.
And I thought, sounds really cool. I was in DC. I'm like, I'll go out to San Francisco. I'll do this for a while. And then I got on the plane and I thought, we're sending a guy from South Carolina to be the U.S. attorney in San Francisco. There's no way that's going to work.
That's funny.
It turned out that I had a blast, and it was one of my best professional years that I've had. But it took a little bit of something to even not realize that didn't make any sense, even
Yeah.
though I had agreed to do it.
Well, thank goodness you didn't even like think about that until you were on the plane. You might not have gotten on the plane,
That's exactly right.
So, aside from these sort of like, maybe, system one or like almost instinctual skills that you've developed from everything we just kind of talked about, what do you look at, now you're in this role, you're back in, the private side, you're not in the public side anymore. What do you draw from the most, do you think? Is it a mentality of like, how the DOJ is going to think about things? Is it just the sort of like the pedigree that you've been able to develop? Just, maybe you can't even point to it anymore, What do you think has been like the biggest lessons that you learned from your time on that side of the fence that really allow you to make the impact that you guys have been able to make over the last few years at Uber?
Yeah, it's probably a little different than a lot of people would think coming from the Department of Justice, but I think it is to understand how to provide advice in a very practical way, and in a way that recognizes the various facets of the particular issue. In a business setting, the goal in a business is not to comply. The goal is to achieve the business objectives that the business has. I've always kind of thought of it as we don't exist to comply, we comply to exist. And sort of I've brought that mentality to it, which is sort of the same. I had that same sort of practical approach when I was in the Department of Justice. We could have a discussion about what the right thing to do was in the context of what is it we're trying to achieve,
Right.
As opposed to it being an isolated issue. And I think it's important in our roles as chief ethics and compliance officers to be able to advise the business in the context of their objectives. And I think oddly enough, I learned that I think at the Department of Justice and then brought it here. And I think it helps me to communicate with stakeholders here with an understanding that what the role of compliance is and an understanding of what the business is trying to achieve and how those two things can align and all get us to the same place we want to go.
Yeah, because there's this sort of branding issue that, I mean, when you talk about ethics and compliance in the way that you just did, that's very different than this sort of caricature that most people have in their minds about what the compliance department is. It's that we exist to comply. I mean, it's the opposite of what you just said, right?
Right.
Did you encounter some of that, caricature thinking in your organization now? And what do you think folks can do beyond just, regurgitating what you just said? What do you think they can do to actually put their kind of words into action, put this sentiment into action within their organization with these other departments whose compliance they need in order to, maintain, the car on the road or whatever?
No, I think just like anytime you're trying to create an impression or to have folks understand what your function is, consistency is key. Mm-hmm. So if you consistently over time are advising business leaders in a way that I just described so that you understand the business objectives, you're looking at risk realistically, you're not taking the view that my role here today is to tell you what you can and can't do, but to have a discussion with you about how you can do what you want to do, or maybe will be occasions where we're going to throw the flag, but for the most part, we're going to try to work towards a solution that mitigates risk and enhances the possibility of achieving business objectives. We can do that together. But you have to just be consistent with that, because I think a lot of people who haven't interacted with compliance and ethics professionals before will assume that what's going to happen is the compliance folks are going to walk in the room and say, you can't do this or you have to do that.
I hadn't thought about that. I was thinking about asking well, how did ethics and compliance sort of get into this mess? How did the compliance department get into this mess where we have this bad reputation, where we're, many folks that we talk to, they're still viewed as a cost center. They're not looked at as a profit center. I use the analogy that they feel like they're at the kiddie table. They want to get up to the grown folks table where all these, where all the stuff that, is exciting is talked about, but they can't seem to find a place for their seat there, and no one's inviting them over. And I've sort of thought until literally just now that that's largely due to something that we've done, that we haven't played our cards right, or we've been like the milk monitor with the whistle. We've been, abusing power or something, or putting sort of compliance over, execution of business objectives. But you just said something kind of interesting where you said, this is just what people are going to think about the folks who are defining those rules. Where do you think it is on that spectrum? Do you think it's kind of a mix? How do you feel like it might be changing a little bit?
Yeah, I can't pretend to be a perfect student of the history of compliance, but I think a lot of it came out of either regulatory requirements or DOJ expectations. So it's not as if I think a lot of companies thought to themselves, what we really need is we need a compliance department. It was essentially foisted on them by the Department of Justice and regulators and financial regulators, health regulators, you name it. Right. So that all of a sudden there was this expectation that companies needed to create this compliance function. And so it arose out of a not necessarily compulsory circumstance, but it wasn't as if business leaders woke up one day and decided the best way for us to have a consistent culture and to ensure compliance with laws and regulations is to build this department that we don't currently have.
Right.
So I think the fact that it wasn't organic probably leads to a lot of the impression that this is something we have to do. The role of these people is to monitor our conduct and to regulate what we do, and that's just who they are, and we have to do it. And so here they are, and we'll make the best of it if we can, or the least of it if we can.
Right.
So.
But if that's what people are expecting, what an opportunity for us to do a pattern interrupt. A pattern interrupt is such a powerful persuasion mechanism to be more memorable or to leave an impression, like you said, make that good first impression. If people are expecting you to be a schlub and you show up in a tuxedo, well, that's a pattern interrupt, or vice versa, right? If they're expecting you to be a rules over everything person, that, compliance over everything person, what a pattern interrupt it can be if you're coming and talking about their needs, or you're talking about how these rules need to fit in the context of these business objectives that we're all actually on the same team. We're all wearing the same uniform. These business objectives that we're all running at. It's a really powerful slight tweak. And it's really, I think, kind of focusing on the other person, right? Like, if you can focus on this other person that you're trying to persuade or make an impression on, versus your own agenda, there's many times a lot more budget in terms of like their attention or their potential compliance, I guess, to see where there is enough overlap to really run forward. It's just interesting, so I like, I'm a big nerd on this whole industry. I just think it's at such an interesting time. I think we're moving from this, industrial economy structure into this knowledge work structure, where now it's really the breeding ground for a lot of the ethical like foundations that have been laid over the last 20 or 30 years. As you look forward, 10, 15 years from now, how do you think our workplaces will have changed in terms of the role that ethics and compliance plays, in terms of how our workplaces, look and feel?
It's a great question, and I'll answer it, but it's not much more than a guess. But I think that we will continue to be more and more data driven. That the whole notion of sort of reporting violations through a helpline to ethics and compliance may become not antiquated, but become a much smaller component of compliance programs that will be doing a lot more data analysis to try to obtain information that may predict where things are going to go badly, or where things might go badly. And we'll be much more data focused, I think, in how we address the risks within the company than we are today. We get obviously good information from the helplines. We rely on employees to report misconduct, and that's an important part of our programs. But if you think about it, it's a pretty blunt instrument to get information about your company, because it's relying on folks to report misconduct who are inherently going to be worried about the consequences of those reports to them. So I think hopefully over the course of the next 10 years, as the function matures, this is happening already on the data side, we'll become much more data driven and less reliant on human intel to evaluate our risks and then to understand how to mitigate them.
I mean, the proportion of like, so I saw this, I was in a presentation, and it was just underscoring that, the percentage of like fraud detected from people speaking up is like 8 to 10 times more than, fraud detection software and all these other, these monitoring, sort of devices. As those devices get better, right, with AI, with whatever, or even when you can start to find those sort of circumstances for, circumstances for fraud, given a couple of sort of, disjointed data points, and you can really start to anticipate that. That's going to be a whole new era of, risk mitigation, where, to your point, the blunt instrument is not the only tool in the toolbox anymore,
Yeah, I think over time it'll be more effective, more efficient, and cheaper, probably. So I think ultimately, if it develops that way, it will actually significantly enhance companies' compliance postures, because you'll just have better understanding of where your risks are and how to go mitigate them.
I want to talk a little bit about this shift that we seem to be feeling from the DOJ and from others. Everybody's sort of talking about effectiveness. The effectiveness of a program, and there's a lot of debate around what that means. I don't know if you've heard any of these things, but some people, are sort of frustrated by. So it kind of seems to sort of trace back to like, I'm no lawyer, as you can tell, but the reasonableness standard. In a court of law, would someone find X, Y, or Z sort of reasonable? It's the same kind of, it feels like it's the same kind of a thing, like what's effective? Well, what's effective for your business might not be effective for my business, or vice versa. I kind of have comfort in that. I think that that's, reasonable, quote unquote. But why do you think people have such a difficulty with that mandate, for lack of a better term? the mandate of like, well, your job is to build an effective program. They're all saying like, well, what does effective mean? I have no idea what that means.
I think there's skepticism. Well, I think there's two reasons. One is testing effectiveness is tricky. It's a little hard to know how do you go about doing that. We've conducted training. You can take post-training surveys. In theory, you can send out post-training, 6 months from now, you can send out a test to the people you've trained and figure out if they still remember what you trained them on. There's some techniques you can invoke to sort of test effectiveness, but I'm not sure any of them are perfect. I think culture surveys help when you're testing sort of the visibility of your helpline or people's willingness to report. So there's a number of metrics you can look at that give you an indication of effectiveness. But again, I think it's all a little imprecise. And I think there's also probably skepticism on the back end that if you actually have an FCPA problem, for example, that folks will deem your program effective no matter what all those numbers, what all those numbers I just referenced might show. And so that I think I'm a little skeptical that if you go in front of the Department of Justice and you say, well, we did all this effectiveness testing, it will help. But it's if you had a problem, and then it's almost hard to make the case that these numbers show our program was effective when you are now discussing that in the context of an FCPA violation.
Yeah, it's like definitionally not effective.
That's right.
So let's jump in our time machine. I don't know if you have your time machine with you, but I want to go back in time to a young Scott. And I want you to give him, this is not going to mess up our current timeline, so no worries. I want you to give him some advice that you wish you had earlier. What is something you've learned over the last X amount of years that, man, you think, I wish I really learned that when I was a younger guy?
It's a great question. I think there's kind of two things I would probably think of. One of them is to define your values as a younger person, to understand to be able to articulate what it is you stand for and why. And the reason I think that is I think it helps make decisions along your journey so much easier if you have sort of defined values to reference. When I look back at my younger life, I probably had a general concept of how I thought I should live my life and what I thought was important and how I should treat people and all those things. But I didn't really have a defined set of values that when I was going to make a career choice or a personal decision, that I could look at those values and reference them and think, what decision is consistent with these things that I believe to be important to myself? And I think that would be if I could turn back time and tell myself that, I would do that, because there's been plenty of times I've struggled with decisions feeling like I don't really know what the frame of reference is. And so I think that's tricky. And then the second piece I would say is, and I didn't come up with this quote, I read it somewhere, but I think more about making the choice right instead of making the right choice. So I think a lot of times when you're confronted with it, when I've been confronted with decisions, I really, really sweated what's the right thing to do, when really what you need to think about is make the decision as well as you can. And then once you've decided it, pour your heart into making that the right decision. Don't be looking back at what other choice you didn't make or what might have happened if you made a different decision, and thinking about how it might have been different if you made a different choice. If you throw yourself into the choice that you actually make, you're probably going to be good, and that will be the right choice because you'll have made it right, not necessarily because you can't do the counterfactual and go back and make the other choice and see how that would come out.
So focus on making your choice right versus making the right choice. Yeah, because if you focus on the latter, the propensity is always going to be to look in that rear view mirror and live in regret for what may have been, and you can drive yourself crazy thinking about that.
Yep.
It's kind of that thinking in bets mentality. It's kind of that poker mentality where it's like, I may lose, but as long as I'm making the right bet, then I have to make that bet. I mean,
that's right.
I could have kings and go all in, and somebody has a 3-8 and they get the full house, and then that's it, but you have to make, I think that's actually a really free, those, interestingly, both of those frameworks that you just said are very like freeing frameworks. Well, hey, I'm going to sort of build a list of values and let those dictate, and I'm just going to run whatever this decision is through those things. And sort of that first one sort of feeds into the second one, or maybe that second one sort of based on the first one, where it's like, okay, well, if I'm faced with this decision and I run it through my values and I really believe these things, and I think that this is the true hierarchy of how things should work in my life, and that if I follow these things, these are going to pay off in the end, then I can like not wring my hands in anxiety around, how it ends up turning out, but you can really go full on in that path forward. Because I mean, when you start to take your eye off the ball, at least for myself, I'd say I've had the most success when I'm all in running at something, and I have had like the most consistent like failure when I'm like kind of waffling. And there is some value in like sort of hitting the beach and burning the boat, so to speak, particularly on a decision that you've made. Those are great. I love this question because it's like, I can just soak it up. I mean, it's such a great piece of wisdom there. So Scott,
Yeah.
oh,
Yeah, I wish I could say I learned those lessons without going through any pain, but I can't.
Well, if I can learn the lessons by going through your pain, by avoiding your pain, then that's going to be great for me. Okay. Scott, this is a lot of fun. I appreciate you hopping on the Ethics Experts today. You have a talk coming up at the FCPA conference. Is that right?
No.
Did I miss that? Okay. Well,
yeah.
You must have had one recently, in which case I heard it was great.
I did do one recently. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. Very good. Where can we see you again? Do you have anything else coming up down the line?
Let's see. I'm attending some compliance conferences in the future. I'm sure I'll see lots of colleagues there. I'm not sure I can think of an imminent public speaking thing, but I'll be sure to let you know, and you can let your folks know if it's going to happen.
All right. Very good. Well, great to meet you. Thank you so much for coming on.